question will be addressed about Arctic climate change and how it affects economic and social activity. We have a very nice program this morning. And our first speaker, I don't know, but I'm a fan of his papers. His name's Tom McGovern. He's from Hunter College. He has his degree from Columbia University. His interests are in mostly the North Atlantic and the Arctic fringe, and he's, I believe, the leader of NABO, the North Atlantic Biocultural Organization. He's at Hunter College, and he will talk about the Norse in Greenland.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'm doing today is representing the past, and there's a lot of it. So I'll try to choose which parts we do, but first I'll put in a brief plug. NABO, North Atlantic Biocultural Organization, means neighbor in many Scandinavian languages, or one of these clever acronyms, and we are, in fact, and have been for a couple decades now, trying to foster neighborly collaboration across the area. There's a whole bunch of us doing this. It's not just me. And in fact, there's too many people to list on a slide here, so I'm borrowing, as usual, from other people's work. Okay, thinking about sudden change. History is full of these things. History is one damn thing after another, but it's not just one damn thing happening after another in the same sequence. As we all know, if you just think about it, for long periods of time, nothing much seems to happen. In fact, it seems incomprehensible that the Austrian regime could fall, that the 19th century Victorian empires could fall, that the Warsaw Pact could collapse. And yet they did, and suddenly. So history is punctuated with really rapid tipping points, periods of very rapid change. As the Chinese would say, interesting times. Indeed, Chinese historians would be wonderful sources if you're interested in looking at people who thought carefully about time moving at different speeds under different circumstances and what constitutes interesting times. So again, I suggest Chinese historiography going back hundreds of years to being a good place to look. The sort of things you're seeing up here are actually being borrowed from much more recent historiography. There's Brodel up there just as a reference here. These are some of the things that historians are thinking about now, and in fact have been thinking about for decades or more. So again, as you're thinking about people, change, time, tipping points, history is a good friend. Many people in the room will be more familiar and comfortable with this kind of a presentation, where we're seeing our old friend now, resilience loops, panicky taking place here. We're seeing resilience and adaptation and connectedness all being plotted, not necessarily going in the same directions at the same time. Now, you can, of course, take these loops and run with them. This is produced by my good friend and colleague, Andy Dugmore, and it's always a pleasure to work with Andy because he's so much smarter than I am. So I'm not going to attempt to explain this, but we'll just move directly onwards to thinking specifically about the Norse. Okay, we have this classic problem, this classic mystery of the North. Europeans go into the New World, briefly in Finland for a longer period, almost 500 years in Greenland, and bad things happen ultimately. Not right away, but after a period of time. So there has been, for hundreds of years, speculation about what happened. What I'd like to address today, though, is essentially what you're probably more familiar with, which was the picture and the story presented by Jared Diamond in his influential and best-selling book, Collapse. Now, we have to take Jared off the hook here, because after all, this is exactly what we told him to say about 8 or 9 years ago. And of course, as good principal investigators, we proceeded to go out and demonstrate that most of what we told him back then actually isn't quite true anymore. So what I'm going to do today is to try to update you on what we now think we should have told Jared had we known. What really happened with the Norse in Greenland, we still don't know, but I think we're coming to a much better understanding of some of the things that didn't happen, some of the things we can let them off the hook for. And let's go forward on that. First of all, a little bit of scene setting. The Norse settlements in Greenland, there's two of them, the eastern and the western settlement, confusingly enough, both on the west coast of Greenland. For the north, there's the Norðsetur, the northern hunting grounds, around in modern Disco Bay, and this was where walrus were hunted. Walrus hunting is a big deal for Greenland. There's the settlements, there's the Norðsetur. Walrus hunting in Greenland, we now suspect, was the reason the colonies got started up. We know that walrus were hunted first in Iceland, probably were made extinct there before the 10th century. And then people moved to Greenland following the walrus. To a considerable degree, walrus hunting is what Norse Greenland was really all about. And it's not a big surprise that there's all sorts of evidence for widespread participation in the walrus hunt. Pieces of that maxilla around the tusk root you see up there are found on many farms all across both settlement areas, including farms that are hours walk uphill from the nearest salt water. So the Nordic hunt was something involved virtually everybody in the community. It was a very big deal. And as you can see from just the distances involved, it was also a very expensive hunt, expensive in terms of time, effort, hazard. So it is a big story. Equally big story is the issue of Greenland actually being green. There is the old story about Eric the Red doing the confidence trick of saying, well, you know, Iceland had a bad name, nobody wanted to settle there, we'll call it Greenland, everybody's going to want to settle there. And that may in fact have been in his mind. But parts of Greenland, the parts in the inner fjords, the parts that are right up against the ice cap in these two areas, these two pockets, do in fact have vegetation as nice as any you'll find in Iceland, and certainly would have been attractive places for farmers to settle. So Greenland is green in some places. Greener than parts of Iceland are now. There's a whole story about Iceland, about erosion, about human impact, and it's a very complicated story too, but that's not what we're going to be telling you this afternoon or this morning. In the picture you see here, though, I just have to mention that right around the year 1000, there were 2 working iron smelters supported by no fewer than 6 charcoal burning pits in this picture. And you trust me on this, there's a farm in this picture too. That was back when there were trees, back when there was soil. All that's gone now. So one of the things that is part of the story in Iceland is massive human impact, irreversible erosion impact. This is not happening under industrialization. This is happening probably in the Viking period, certainly by the Middle Ages. So this happened in Iceland. Did it happen in Greenland too? Did the Greenlanders set themselves up for bad things happening later when the climate changed? Well, here's another slide from Andy Dugmore. And what he's suggesting to you here by his geomorphology is the answer to that question is no. Actually, recent work in landscape in Greenland suggests pretty strongly that all of the indicators we should be seeing if there was a major erosion events being triggered by human impact just aren't there. So the erosion impact that happened in Iceland didn't happen in Greenland. Something's going on here. Same people, same language, very similar economy, real different impact on landscape and resources. So we can't blame the Norse Greenlanders for destroying their own pastures. They didn't. There's a caribou story here too. Of course, there aren't any caribou in Iceland, but there are caribou in Greenland. But the caribou in Greenland, as many of you are aware, are very vulnerable to local extinctions. They're broken up into little pockets. And some of the pockets, especially in the southwest where the Norse lived, are very vulnerable to sudden death from range icing in wintertime. In addition to that, when the Norse lived there, they hunted caribou pretty intensively. We have found remnants of drive systems. We have recovered the bones of big hunting dogs, which were used for caribou hunting. And certainly there's also competition with Norse sheep and goats and cows grazing the same pastures the caribou were grazing. And yet, in all the time the Norse were there, nearly 500 years, they did not make the caribou extinct. And yet, shortly after 1800, when firearms were introduced to Inuit Greenlanders who succeeded the Norse, they made the caribou extinct in the eastern settlement within a generation. So this is the case for those Norsemen who have such a bad rep for environmental management actually seems to have done sustainable resource use for multiple generations through multiple climate fluctuations, despite the fact that the caribou are inherently hard to manage in this environment. But they did it. And then there's the seal story. As the Norse crossed the North Atlantic from Europe, from Iceland, they went across by geography, clearly. As many of you know far better than I, here they are suddenly encountering Arctic seals. They're encountering 2 migratory species, hooded seals and harp seals in vast numbers, and smaller numbers of non-migratory ringed seals and bearded seals. We know from the bone piles from their middens that they went after these migratory seals very enthusiastically, very effectively. They're filling up their bone piles with dead seals. What they're not doing is taking the breathing hole seals, the bearded seals, the ringed seals at all, or in any numbers. We also don't have any barbed harpoons. Not even no toggling harpoons such as the Inuit were using, but no barbed spears at all. It really looks as though these folks are hunting in a very different way. And we suspect what they're doing is they're using boat drives and nets and clubbing on ice They're bringing together labor from many different farms to attack these migratory seals as they move through the outer fjord zone in their own area. So we suspect that our previous beating up of these guys for not adopting Inuit harpoon-based hunting technology may be missing the point a bit. And a better way, a better view, is this one. I know it's a bit messy. What you're seeing here is the aftermath of a Greenland. This is what happens when the Faroese hunt pilot whales. They drive them up on the beach. They bring the whole population comes running down, men, women, children, everybody. There's a brief flurry of activity, then you have all these dead whales. Now I have to say, 2 hours after this picture was taken, that beach was clean. Every single whale had been distributed to the community, cut up, were in people's freezers, were being distributed to old people's homes, to schools, and were shared out among the community of people, those houses you see behind in that picture, according to a schedule, according to proportions worked out in 1200. The Faroese have a really strongly regulated system for hunting these animals and for distributing their meat. And they've been doing it for centuries. And it is a core of their self-identification. One of the first things and the most persistent things that the Faroese use cell phones for is coordinating Grind, is getting everybody down to the beach in enough numbers to get the job done. And they do it. It is really a core of Faroese self-identification. Notice little kids on the beach there. Now the Faroese are well aware that this kind of a picture is not ecotourism friendly. But there is no discussion at all in the Faroes about limiting, banning, or changing the Grind. It is seen as being critical to maintaining a Faroese identity. It is deeply embedded in the society. I bring this up not only because it probably gives you a better understanding of what Norse sealing was like in Greenland, but also to make the point that as in the past as in the present, these kinds of subsistence activities, especially that require the coordination of a lot of people's labor, are deeply embedded in people's identification of who they are. It's not easy to change. Okay, bone piles. If you read the graph real quickly, the pale is seals, and as you can see, for small farms like V48, by the 14th century, these guys are pretty much seal hunters who have a few cows. And even if you look at the larger farms on the other side, seals are playing a really major part in the economy, at least as far as we can tell from the zooarchaeology. Here's another view of zooarchaeology changed through time. This is just a ratio of marine to terrestrial, the marine to virtually all seals. Taller bar means more seals. I think you can read that one pretty easily. As time changes, boy, these guys go further into the marine food web. Boy, do seals become more important. This is good because this is pretty much exactly the results produced by our good friends and colleagues in Scandinavia. You had Arneborg and her team looking at human isotopes, carbon isotopes, which also are showing people moving into the marine food web, with one exception. There's a guy who's fairly late, not eating a whole lot of seals. He's this guy. He's the bishop. He's buried under the floor of the cathedral. He's got a gold ring in his finger. He's got an ivory crozier in his hand. Bishop in the Arctic? Where does he come from? Brief digression. One of the many things you can use a polar bear for is getting a bishop. In 1127, the Greenlanders, according to their own story, got together and decided that they were rich enough and prosperous enough to get their own bishop, went to the King of Norway with a live polar bear, and came home with a live bishop. The bishop was not happy. But as the story ends, at the end of the thing, he consoled himself by taking over the best land, the best property in all of Greenland. If we turn to the archaeology, lots of different ways to measure sites. In this case, we're just doing a plot of haul area versus cattle buyer area. And I'm afraid there are no extra credit points given to you for guessing which one of these is the bishop's farm. He did quite well. So we have here definitely evidence of stratification. This is not an egalitarian society at all. There is certainly top-down management taking place here. And in the past, we've beaten the Greenlanders up for this too and said that, well, gee, these guys are all just a bunch of foreigners. They were. Not one bishop was local. They were all coming from the outside. And what did they know about management society? That may still be a criticism, but we're suspecting it's a bit too simple. So if we sort of sum up where Greenland was in 1300, it's not big. There are somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 Greenlanders total. 6,000 is probably the uppermost limit. They are based in the inner fjord farms, and that's a limitation, because if climate changes, they can't move very easily up and down the coast of Greenland. they certainly are well integrated in taking communal labor. They're moving people all around the landscape, people coming down from the inner fjords. They're going seal hunting. Seal bones are found far inland. Seabird bones are found far inland. So we're seeing certainly archaeological evidence, something very much like that Faroese Greenland, but operating on a much larger geographical scale. They also seem to be pretty good at conserving caribou. They don't make them extinct, and this cannot be an accident. Also, they seem to be pretty good at not doing what their Icelandic relatives were doing, which is triggering large-scale soil erosion. So something's going right. The Norse hunt and the walrus ivory continues to be a major issue. And they're building big churches out of it. The church you see on the side here was furnished with stained glass and imported English church bells. Pretty big deal. Especially if you realize where they are. Especially if you realize this church is bigger than most of the Icelandic churches. And the Icelandic population is 10 times the size of the Greenlanders. So, okay, religion and churches are important to them. They are the westernmost outpost in evil Christianity. They have written law codes, many of which we're pretty sure are about resource use. The Icelandic law codes are about this. We don't know the details of Greenlandic ones, but the Icelanders do mention that they existed and they were different from the ones that they used. Okay, then bad things start to happen, and pretty quickly. As far as we can tell, no church is constructed after 1300. The western settlement becomes abandoned somewhere between 1350 and 1355. The last recorded contact, which includes a marriage and a guy being burned for witchcraft, is in 1408. The eastern settlement's probably all gone by 1450. So the end game seems to happen pretty quick. Last 2 generations, maybe, things were happening pretty fast, pretty bad, with a fatal outcome. Everybody dies. So what happened? Well, a bunch of things are happening at once. There's a decline in demand for ivory, that people are turning to these snazzy enamel boxes instead for showing how rich and powerful and hip they are. So changing fashion. Globalization isn't new. This is happening back in the Middle Ages as well. Changing fashion thousands of miles away in Europe is having an impact on the Norse Greenlanders, of course. And then, of course, there's climate change. Everybody says lots about that. We have in the past, too. Certainly, declining temperatures are not good news for the Greenlanders. And equally important, interannual variability seems to be increasing, which is also very bad news if you're an Arctic farmer attempting to judge where to go. There's also, of course, the issue of new neighbors. The Norse were in contact with the Dorset Paleo-Eskimos since they got there, but starting around 1200, they came in contact with folks who are coming ultimately from Alaska and from the Bering Sea region. We now know from our colleagues who work in this area that this is a place that sees increasing warfare. So just as modern Scandinavians are far more peaceful than their Viking ancestors, so modern Inuit are probably far more peaceful than their ancestors. This is another thing that goes in cycles. Okay, so we don't know as much as we might about Thule Norse contact in Greenland, but we do know that after 1300, we do see settlements of Inuit people in the outer fjord sealing zones that the Norse themselves were using. If things went bad in their relationship, the Thule folks were far better placed to injure the Norse than vice versa. Okay, so then we're left with a summary of this issue of the Norse not looking so poorly adapted, not looking like this clumsy bunch of Europeans who don't know how to live in the Arctic. Now we're seeing a different picture, which I might suggest is a little scarier. They are kind of sustainable, aren't they? You know, 400, 500 years? How long has it been since Jamestown Colony, eh? Who are we to judge sustainability? All these things that didn't happen, all this communal activity, all this organization, these written codified laws for resource use, preventing tragedies of the commons being enforced both by top-down management and by bottom-up community support. Boy, that's an awful lot like all the prescriptions which we are giving people throughout the world today about how to organize yourselves, how to survive, how to be sustainable, how to get a World Bank loan. The Norse checked all those boxes and they're still dead. So we have this problem of explaining their collapse and this worst possible outcome. Empty churches, nobody's putting flowers in the graves anymore, the culture is dead. How do we explain this if they're not so dumb and clumsy? If they're in fact actually pretty clever and pretty resourceful and pretty sustainable for a long period of time? Many of you in the audience may be thinking about island biogeography, old colonist tramps, resilience versus adaptation, K versus R strategy. Is it the problem that they are in fact well adapted, specialized, efficient? That's the problem, perhaps, that they do have a community behind them, that they are well organized, they do have all these things in their favor. are those actually really in their favor? So then we have the question, are we smarter than the Vikings? So we have then this thing about the Norsemen. They have made a good whipping boy about all the things that they did that were dumb, that we're far too smart to do. I suggest to you, the pictures looking here suggest a couple of things. A new view of the Norsemen might be actually that they weren't so dumb. They made choices which in retrospect may have been mistakes, but they made other choices which were successful. The real problem was they were small, they were isolated, they were relatively powerless, they didn't have big machines to help them out. They were doing everything they could and they still lost. We have a far better set of cards dealt to us. We have the ability not to pay a stupidity tax and to be smarter without necessarily giving up everything that makes our lives worth living. If the French can successfully enforce a ban on smoking Gauloise in cafes in Paris, I submit to you that Americans might just possibly be able to give up this. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple questions.
Good. Yeah, I like your presentation, but I don't particularly agree with your eliminating one by one causes when it seems multiple causes are probably involved. You didn't mention, for example, the cut down of ship traffic from Europe that was timed with the Black Death and the disaster in Europe, break off of the trade, and that the ivory was part of the. It was primarily the church, and the church suffered the same way in breaking down that trade. So it was economic cutoff that was another player in this. And then there's some Ben Fredskill's Holland analysis of sediments showing that there was local overgrazing, probably mostly with the bishop's cattle. You mentioned poor management. So there was a combination of factors. Caribou can be locally extirpated from hunting and be a disaster for people, but they're wide-ranging animals, as you pointed out. So you don't have to say they didn't go extinct and therefore they were available. They probably declined, and we see some of Melgard's excavation with population fluctuation in caribou on all of it around the coast of Greenland. So I think that trying to, and of course, to the collapse hypothesis, as you pointed out, I mean, it's too much emphasis of one cause when there are multiple causes. And soil erosion, no, it's totally different soil on Greenland than the light volcanic soils of Iceland, which are extremely erodible. So it's all of these multiple factors that were involved, and it's hard to put emphasis on any one or to reject any one as a contributing.
The points I didn't make, which I should have, is what we're really talking about here is conjuncture, is a whole lot of things coming together at once. And I think the point that I really like you to take isn't just that they weren't idiots, that's one point, but the second point, what they're really victims of, is things coming together at the same time. That they have Inuit competition, which in itself could have been dealt with. They had climate change, they had breaking off contact with Europe, they had soil erosion, which is taking place locally. There's certainly also is sea level change, which is a problem that some of we know some of their pastures being destroyed. There's a whole bunch of bad things that are coming together, and the bad luck they're having is that they're tending to happen at the same time. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing them dying as a tipping point rather than them coming back with a back loop. I mean, the real problem with the whole panarchy loop for the Norsemen is there isn't a back loop. You know, but perhaps there could have been situations that they could have gotten through it, that I think that they're far more resilient than we had given them credit for. But I think that the answer is the very point you're making, is that there are too many things happening at once. So certainly this isn't at all monocausal. There's lots of things going on here. And I think what they're victims of isn't so much bad luck as is their place in history. It was their place to get to a place where all the things were happening at once and it went beyond their capacity to realistically cope. And I think hopefully we're in a better position than that right now.
Tom, it's very hard to debate in your own field, but you repeatedly keep saying that they were dying. They're actually not dead. They were mostly gone. Some people were dead, but most of them somehow miraculously disappeared. Yeah. So if we take gone as an adaptation, because they were not dead, as a strategy to leave the place, which became, not that hospitable to them. So that's a very different strategy. They perhaps, they lose in a certain sense because they didn't succeed in the ecosystem, which changed. But on the other hand, they did not become extinct. They just moved. Can this be used as an interpretation?
There is there is a view, which I really wish I could subscribe to wholeheartedly, that they all left. That they went someplace, they went back, they got a ticket home, and they went back to Norway. And what you're seeing here is the sort of thing we see happening in the 19th century when times get hard in Scandinavia, people migrate, or when times get hard in the 13th and 14th centuries in Norway, people go downhill. The problem is we don't have a single reference to anybody from Greenland returning home. Not to say it didn't happen, but the suspicion is it didn't happen in any great numbers. If the Greenlanders had returned to Iceland in great numbers, it would have instantly generated court cases because they would have been starting to claim farms that their ancestors left behind, and there's just nothing. I really like to think that it was a happy ending, that people trickled out gradually, and maybe some people did. And of course, it's also a situation if some of your youngest, best, brightest, most active people leave the community, go home to Norway, go to Iceland, drop out of history, they also dropping out of Greenland. And this could certainly be part of the problem you're facing if you're trying to stay back in Greenland and stay viable. So although I'd like to have them survive, I don't think they did. I think this really is a case of not only cultural but also biological extinction taking place. And again, remember, there's not very many of them.
Just a naive question. Did the caribou find their own way to Greenland? I mean, they were there when the Norse arrived?
Caribou seem to be have very complex biology in Greenland, and Morten Melgaard has got a really nice dissertation on that if you're interested. But they seem to they seem to have immigrated to Greenland several times, and there may have been several extinction events that took on either all of Greenland or much of Greenland at different periods. The topography with the ice coming down to the ocean in several places tends to make populations break up, so that you have very different morphology of caribou in different parts of Greenland, and they seem to have somewhat different settlement trajectories or survival trajectories. So keeping the caribou going in the eastern settlement, again, not making them extinct is a bit of an accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, thanks very much.